Inside the prison no one escapes, until he did. The shock. If you believe no one can outsmart fate, you've never heard this story. Subscribe, and let's begin. The sound of the siren cut through the fog like a blade. June 12, 1962, 6:30 a.m., Alcatraz Island, San Francisco Bay. Guards raced down cell block B, flashlights slicing through the gloom. One after another, they shouted roll call numbers that echoed off the steel walls. But when they reached cell 138, the voice cracked mid-sentence. Frank Morris. Silence. The beam of a flashlight froze on something that wasn't right, a man's face staring blankly up from the pillow, eyes open, hair matted. But it wasn't breathing. It wasn't alive. The guard stepped closer, then screamed. The head rolled off the pillow and hit the concrete floor with a hollow thud. It was made of plaster, soap, and human hair. Frank Morris was gone. By 7 a.m., the prison was in full lockdown. Sirens blared across the bay. Guards sprinted up and down the tiers, rattling bars, shouting orders, and tearing sheets off bunks. But every second brought more dread. 2 more cells were empty. John and Clarence Anglin. Brothers. Bank robbers. And now, ghosts. Captain Paul Maddox, the warden's right hand, stood frozen at the end of the block, staring into 3 empty cells that should have been inescapable. The vent holes behind each bunk looked too small for a man's shoulders. Yet they were hollowed out, scraped clean with sharpened spoons and drill bits made from vacuum motor parts. Maddox muttered under his breath, "They dug through the goddamn walls." And beyond the holes, a shadowy corridor of pipes and rust, leading into darkness. The warden arrived minutes later, his face pale beneath his hat. "Seal the dock. Nobody gets on or off this island." Helicopters churned overhead, searchlights sweeping across the cold water. From above, Alcatraz looked like a stranded fortress, a jagged rock surrounded by gray death. No man had ever made it across those waters alive. But inside the utility corridor, officers found something else, a workshop. Sheets of rubber cut from stolen raincoats. A handmade raft. A concertina of air hoses. And hidden beneath a pile of rags, a crude map of the bay. It wasn't just an escape. It was an operation. By noon, the FBI was on the island. Agent Vincent Parker, a veteran with eyes like sharpened glass, took one look at the dummy heads and shook his head. "This wasn't desperation," he said. "This was genius." He examined the details, the brush strokes on the fake ears, the lashes made of real hair. "They had help," he said softly. "Someone on the inside." But who? Outside the prison, the world was transfixed. Radio stations interrupted regular programming. Headlines screamed. "Escape from Alcatraz, impossible." Reporters gathered along the shoreline, cameras aimed at the mist-covered rock. Families of guards panicked. Politicians called for answers. And somewhere in the chaos, the ocean itself seemed to mock them, endless, cold, hiding everything it chose to keep. By sunset, the search was already failing. The Coast Guard combed 30 miles of shoreline. Boats found fragments, a paddle, a deflated life jacket, and a wallet sealed in plastic. Inside, photographs of the Anglin brothers smiling, arms around their mother. But no bodies. No footprints. No clues. Just silence. That night, Captain Maddox couldn't sleep. He sat in his office overlooking the dark bay, the sound of waves crashing like a heartbeat he couldn't quiet. He replayed the morning in his mind, the fake heads, the holes, the map. They must have drowned. Everyone said it. But something about the plan, the precision, the patience, told him otherwise. He pulled out the confiscated map and traced a line from Alcatraz toward the Marin Headlands, a rugged stretch of cliffs just north of the bridge. If they timed it right with the tides, and if the raft held. Then maybe, just maybe, they could have made it. Across the bay, in a small diner near Sausalito, a fisherman named Harold Dutton sat with a cup of coffee gone cold. He'd just come in from the water that morning, his clothes still damp, his face gray. When the radio mentioned Alcatraz, he stopped breathing. Because hours earlier, just before dawn, he'd seen something strange drifting through the fog, a makeshift raft, low in the water, carrying 3 figures paddling silently toward the shoreline. He'd thought it was a dream. Now, he wasn't so sure. Back on the island, FBI agent Parker received a phone call. A fisherman's report. 3 silhouettes seen north of the bridge. He jotted it down, eyes narrowing. "We'll check it." But by the time they reached the area, the tide had shifted. The current had swallowed the shoreline. No raft. No trace. Still, Parker couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. He turned to Maddox and said, "You know what the funny part is?" "What?" "Every man who ever tried to swim off this rock froze to death halfway. But tonight, the tide was warm." Days turned to weeks. The media frenzy faded. Official reports declared all 3 men dead, drowned in the bay. But years later, strange things began to surface. A photograph sent anonymously to the FBI, 2 men standing in front of a farmhouse in Brazil, looking just like the Anglin brothers. A Christmas card signed, "John and Clarence." A letter postmarked from Florida, claiming to be from Frank Morris himself. "I made it. I'm still alive. And I'm free." For Captain Maddox, retirement brought no peace. He kept a folder locked in his desk, a collection of every tip, every lead, every rumor. And one night in 1975, he received an unmarked envelope. Inside, a faded Polaroid. 2 old men sitting on a porch, smiling at the camera. Written on the back, "You were right. We made it." Maddox stared at the photo for a long time. The handwriting matched Frank's prison forms exactly. But that wasn't what chilled him. In the background of the picture, there was something familiar, the outline of Alcatraz, faint, across the bay. The spiral. It was winter, 1979, 17 years after the escape, when the FBI officially shut down the Alcatraz file. "Presumed drowned," the report read. 3 words that erased the most embarrassing breach in federal prison history. But not everyone believed it. Agent Vincent Parker had retired 5 years earlier, trading fieldwork for silence on the California coast. Yet the ghosts of Alcatraz wouldn't leave him alone. Every few months, an envelope arrived, no return address, no sender. Inside, a single photograph, a fragment of a map, or a note scribbled in block letters. "You stopped looking too soon." The letters were taunts. But they felt too personal, too informed. Whoever sent them knew details that were never released, like the location of the utility corridor, or the handmade paddle discovered wedged in a seawall. Parker tried to ignore them, until one envelope arrived that changed everything. Inside was a black and white photo, of an abandoned boathouse on the northern shore of the bay. Scribbled beneath it, "Look under the floor." The next morning, Parker drove across the bridge, fog curling around his headlights. The boathouse was real, half-collapsed, forgotten by time. He pried open the door and stepped into the dark. The air smelled of salt and rot. He found the trapdoor almost immediately, a square panel hidden beneath warped boards, secured with rusted nails. Beneath it, a small crawl space. And inside, a bundle wrapped in waterproof canvas. He dragged it into the light. Inside were 3 things. A decayed raincoat patch identical to those used in the Alcatraz raft. A small pocketknife engraved with the initials FM. And a hand-drawn diagram of the prison, marked with red ink, circling a point beneath the cell block, Maintenance Tunnel 3. Parker froze. He'd worked that case for years. There was no Tunnel 3 in any official schematic. Unless it had been erased. 2 days later, he was back on Alcatraz, as a civilian visitor this time. The island had been turned into a museum for tourists, the gift shop full of keychains and t-shirts that said, "I escaped Alcatraz." But Parker wasn't here for souvenirs. He waited until the last ferry left, flashing an old badge at the park ranger. "I'm doing a private follow-up for an archival project," he said. The ranger hesitated, then handed him the keys. Inside, the prison was colder than he remembered. His footsteps echoed off the empty tier, metal creaking with every gust of wind. He reached cell 138, Frank Morris's old cell, and crouched behind the bunk. The hole was still there, covered with plexiglass for tourists. He pried it open and crawled through. Dust, rust, silence. The same air that 3 men once breathed on their way to freedom. The service tunnel was a maze of pipes and darkness. Parker followed the markings on the diagram, left at the first junction, straight through the boiler room, then down a narrow corridor sealed by a welded grate. He forced it open with a crowbar and entered a chamber he'd never seen before. Maintenance Tunnel 3. But it wasn't just maintenance. The walls were carved with names, hundreds of them, inmates who'd worked on construction decades earlier. But one name appeared again and again, scratched deep into the stone. Art Bowman. Parker flipped through his old notes. No inmate by that name had ever served at Alcatraz. Then he noticed something else, a faint draft coming from behind the wall. He pressed his ear against the concrete. Hollow. He tapped it twice, then swung the crowbar. The wall cracked. Dust poured out. Behind it was a small hidden room, maybe 6 by 6 feet. Inside, a metal desk, a chair, and a rusted lockbox. He pried it open. Inside were documents stamped, classified, Naval Operations, 1943. Blueprints. Letters. A journal labeled property of Art Bowman. The first entry made Parker's blood run cold. April 1943. Command has approved the construction of a secondary access beneath Cell Block B, official reason, emergency drainage. Actual purpose, transfer route 4, Project Aurora. Project Aurora. He'd never heard of it. The entries continued. We were told to conceal the tunnel after the war. The warden insisted it be removed from all records. But I left an opening near the utility shaft, sealed with plaster. Only someone desperate enough to dig would ever find it again. Someone had found it, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. This wasn't just an escape route. It was a forgotten government tunnel, one that had existed before the prison even opened. The men hadn't created a plan. They'd discovered one. Parker took photos of everything and slipped the journal into his bag. But as he climbed back toward the main corridor, he noticed something unsettling. The grate he'd forced open was now closed. Someone else was in the prison. He turned off his flashlight, holding his breath. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, slow, deliberate, scraping against metal. He called out, "Ranger? That you?" No answer. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer. Parker gripped the crowbar and backed toward the cell tunnel. A shadow crossed the beam of light for just a second, tall, lean, wearing what looked like a prison-issue jacket. And then it was gone. He didn't wait to find out who it was. He ran, through the tunnels, across the cell block, out into the open air, heart hammering like a drum. But when he reached the ferry dock, the padlock was still sealed. No one else had come ashore that night. At least, not officially. The next morning, Parker took the evidence to a retired colleague at the Bureau's San Francisco office, Agent Laura Hennessy, one of the few people he trusted. She studied the journal. "If this is real," she said, "then the government buried more than just an escape. They buried an entire project." "Aurora," Parker said. You ever heard of it? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Only in fragments. Unofficial testing during the war, psychological manipulation, sound isolation. They used Alcatraz before it became a prison. Parker frowned. And you think they kept it going? Or tried to erase it? That night, Parker got another envelope. No stamp. No address. Inside was a single Polaroid, his photo, taken through the cracked glass of his window. Written across the bottom. You're getting close. He stared at it until dawn. Whoever was behind this, they were watching. Days later, the FBI quietly reopened the case under the code name Operation Tidefall. Agents re-examined the prison records, cross-referenced old naval files, and sent divers into the bay. 3 weeks in, they found something buried in the silt, a sealed military crate less than a mile from the island. Inside, rusted tools, fragments of rubber, and a metal ID tag stamped, R. Bowman. The name from the tunnel wall. But that wasn't the real discovery. Inside the crate was a cassette tape, wrapped in wax paper. Faded handwriting on the label read, "For the one still looking." Parker slid it into an old recorder and pressed play. Static. Then a man's voice, low, trembling, recorded decades earlier. "This is Frank Morris. If you're hearing this, it means we made it. But Alcatraz was never what you thought it was. We didn't escape from a prison. We escaped from an experiment." The tape ended. Silence. Parker looked up, his reflection staring back in the dark glass window, and for the first time in 17 years, he realized. The story everyone thought was over, had just begun. The reckoning. Rain hammered against the San Francisco skyline as Agent Vincent Parker sat in his apartment, staring at the cassette recorder on his desk. Frank Morris's voice still echoed in his head. "We didn't escape from a prison. We escaped from an experiment." He'd listened to it 100 times. The words changed each time, sometimes a confession, sometimes a warning. But tonight, under the hiss of the rain, it sounded like a plea. Somewhere between guilt and obsession, Parker made a decision: he'd go back one last time. 3 weeks later, under the cover of a storm, he returned to Alcatraz, not as a tourist, not as a detective, but as a man chasing ghosts. The island was closed for the night. The wind screamed through the corridors like voices from another century. He walked past the rows of empty cells, their bars gleaming under flashes of lightning. In his bag, the tape recorder, the Bowman journal, and a flashlight. At the base of the cell block, he found the hidden panel that led to the maintenance corridor. He pried it open and descended. The air was thick and cold, heavy with salt and iron. He retraced his steps, through the boiler room, past the tunnel markings, until he reached the sealed chamber again. Except this time, it wasn't empty. A generator hummed faintly in the corner. And across the room, against the far wall, someone had set up a table, littered with papers, photographs, and something that looked like medical equipment. Parker froze. The documents bore the same header, Project Aurora, Continuation Program. They were recent. Dated 1978. He flipped through them. Subject reports, psychological analyses, exposure notes. Then he saw a familiar name, Anglin, C. His heart stopped. Clarence Anglin. Status, active subject. Parker's flashlight trembled. He turned the page. There was a photo clipped to the file, a grainy image of a man in his 60s, sitting in a chair, eyes vacant. The caption read, "Taken 1978, undisclosed facility." The next file, Morris, F. Status, deceased, test terminated. Test terminated. Not drowned. Parker stepped back, the realization sinking in, the government had continued experimenting on the escapees. Not to punish them, but to finish what they'd started decades earlier. Project Aurora hadn't been about prisons or security. It was about control. Sound deprivation. Sleep manipulation. Neural conditioning. Experiments on human behavior under extreme isolation. Alcatraz had been their perfect lab, isolated, deniable, invisible. And somehow, Frank Morris had uncovered it. A noise behind him. Parker spun around, flashlight shaking. Someone stood in the doorway. A man, older, face worn by time, but unmistakable, the same angular jaw, the same haunted eyes from the mugshots he'd memorized. "Frank." Parker whispered. The man didn't speak. He stepped forward, movements stiff, mechanical, like someone half remembering how to walk. Then, a flicker of recognition. His voice cracked. "Don't, go deeper." Parker swallowed hard. "You're alive." "They never stopped," Frank rasped. "We escaped the island, but not the program. They found us. Brought us back. Tried to make us forget." He pressed his hand to his temple. "But I remember now." He pointed toward the far corner, where a steel door stood half open. "They're still below. The old lab. It's still running." Parker's pulse thundered in his ears. "Who's running it?" Frank's answer was barely audible. "You wouldn't believe me." Lightning flashed, the power flickered, and when the light steadied, Frank was gone. Only the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. Parker followed the noise, pushing through the steel door and into a staircase that spiraled downward into the rock. The deeper he went, the warmer the air became, until he reached a long, low tunnel humming with electrical current. At the end stood a vault door marked, "Restricted, Naval Archive 47A." It wasn't locked. Inside, rows of machines buzzed quietly, oscillators, reel-to-reel recorders, and strange devices pulsing with red light. Along the walls, hundreds of tapes labeled with prisoner numbers. And in the center of the room, a single operating chair, its leather cracked, restraints still fastened. Above it, a sign bolted to the ceiling. "Project Aurora, Behavioral Reconditioning Protocol." Parker began recording everything, photos, notes, documents, his hands shaking. Then his flashlight caught something on the ground, a newer folder stamped, Subject P001. He opened it. Inside was his own file. Vincent Parker. Born 1919. FBI agent, assigned to Alcatraz, 1962. Psychological exposure testing initiated, June 12, 1962. His mouth went dry. The date of the escape. The words below blurred in his vision. Memory conditioning successful. Subject unaware of prior participation. Continue behavioral observation through correspondence phase. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. He wasn't investigating the project, he'd been part of it. Suddenly, the generator cut out. The room went dark. In the blackness, the tape machines began to play, one by one, each whispering fragments of voices, screams, and laughter, looping endlessly. And then, through the static, Frank's voice again. "You're still on the island, Vincent. You never left." Parker bolted up the staircase, flashlight flickering, breath ragged. He burst through the cell corridor and into the open air, or what felt like it. The fog was thicker than ever, the lighthouse beam sweeping over a black sea. But the lights of San Francisco were gone. The bridge, gone. The world beyond, gone. Only the island remained. At dawn, the Coast Guard responded to a distress call from Alcatraz. They found the main gate open, but no signs of forced entry. Inside, they discovered Parker's flashlight, his recorder, and a folder of photographs. The last recording on the tape ended abruptly with a single sentence. "The prison was never meant to keep men in, it was built to keep something else from getting out." Weeks later, a journalist investigating Parker's disappearance received a letter with no return address. Inside, a single photograph. Two men sitting on a porch, smiling at the camera. Frank Morris and Vincent Parker. Written on the back. Freedom comes at a price. Don't come looking. Epilogue. In 2013, a letter surfaced at an FBI field office in San Francisco. It was postmarked from Brazil. The handwriting matched the old case files. My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962. Frank didn't make it, but I did. We were part of something bigger. If you find this, know one thing: Alcatraz isn't a prison. It's a test that never ends. The case was reopened, quietly. And to this day, no one knows who, or what, is really buried beneath that island. If you think this story was intense, wait till you hear the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss it.